on the web page, so should you want to go and read them, feel free. I want to say two things very quickly. One, to extend the thanks and the congratulations to the organising committee, yet again, for a terrific conference, and to draw attention to the quality of the papers that I have witnessed today as being up there with the best I've ever seen of Beckett, and now me. Right. This paper came about because I was asked to speak at an initiative that became known as Teachers Week in Education City in Doha last April. An education portfolio expert at Qatar Foundation asked me to join a committee to establish a Teachers Week, which was to be put into effect because Sheikh Hind, director of Qatar Foundation, quote, wanted faculty to have a voice. A panel of professors was assembled and entrusted with the responsibility of framing Hind's idea into a week of lectures and activities. Then in the preparation stage, the brief of having a voice began to evolve into a focus on technology and developing technology as a mark of our pedagogic progress. Trying to keep up with the rapidly changing context and yet still stay true to my original intention of representing the education faculty voice as one obliged to advocate for nationwide labour reform, I began to conceive speaking of the human voice as a form of technology in the first instance, in order to keep abreast of this changing paradigm. Also, I wanted to pursue a neo-Heideggerian emphasis on the voice as techne that calls forth political obligation. By the time the week of talks arrived, my metaphorical and philosophical framing of the idea of voice as representing the possibility of political change had become entirely marginalized. By way of example, when I gave the paper itself, I found myself on a panel with a professor from Carnegie Mellon, Qatar, who spoke at some length about his ongoing research attempts to consolidate a neural network map of Warren Buffett's brain. Thank you. Okay. So, nonetheless, while I was exploring human voice in its technique capacity, I learned a great many things. For example, the mechanism for generating the human voice can be subdivided into three parts: the lungs, the vocal folds within the larynx, and the articulators. The lung, the pump, must produce adequate airflow and air pressure to vibrate vocal cords. The vocal folds then vibrate to use airflow from the lungs to create audible pulses that form the laryngeal sound source. While studying the voice, I also came across this. Gracias. Okay. The image is a spectrogram of a human voice, which is a visual representation of the spectrum of frequencies of sound as they vary with time. And I love the word spectrogram because it carries within it the spectre of a ghost. And as I sat through tech talk after tech talk during Teachers Week, this spectral presence of a voice became more a ghost in the machine, drawing attention to all the dead voices active in our increasingly technological and technocratic society. In other words, within the discourse, I heard a douce machina articulated, or rather disarticulated, by Samuel Beckett. This is a kind of a terrific reenactment of what it is I'm proposing to talk about, so maybe we'll just... Okay, well, I think, don't worry about it. People are familiar with the piece, and I want to keep moving. So, I feel that this exchange suggests that, and the exchange is, I'll read it to you actually. In the meantime, let us try and converse calmly, since we are incapable of keeping silent. You're right, we're inexhaustible. It's so we won't think, we have that excuse. It's so we won't hear, we have our reasons. All the dead voices, they make a noise like wings, like leaves, like sand, like leaves. They all speak together. I read this exchange to suggest that in contrast to the idea of a singular subjectivity, it is arguably the case that when a subject speaks to and of itself, it speaks with the words of others. In other words, or in others' words, the subject is defined by the voices of the past. As Leonard Lawler puts it, the many voices are in me. It is impossible for me to hear myself speak all alone. There is always a very quiet murmur coming from the past. Others' voices contaminate the hearing of myself speaking. Just as my present moment is never immediate, my interior monologue is never simply my own. Arguably then, the purpose of voice is to allow the we to speak in all of the time, space and history we inhabit. Relatedly, Lawler suggests, the purpose of a work of art or a work of philosophy lies in calling forth a new people, a new we. And in doing so, he echoes Heidegger's approach to subjectivity in his 1954 essay, The Question Concerning Technology. But he also adapts Heidegger, channeling we in all of its pluralism in contradistinction to Heidegger's emphasis on the singular hero of being who might emerge. So I'm going to skip, let's not worry about the slides, I'm just going to go with it, right? So the next slide introduces the concept of technologia. And I'm proposing that in his essay, Heidegger traces what the phrase technologia originally meant, namely art, craft, and oracle or divine word. Thus the meaning was to be skilled with art and or craft and used in service of meaningful words, such as the composition of the Book of Kells or other such divine texts. Further, for Heidegger, the essence of technology is not something we make, it is a mode of being or of revealing truth. Thinking of voice as a technology that reveals truth in this Heideggerian sense, it is interesting to think of Stephen Hawking as perhaps the most famous example of technological voice, one that defines being and brings forth the truth of scientific progress. He had a rare early onset, slow progressing form of amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. And this gradually paralyzed him over the decades, leading to his death in March of this year. As a result of his condition, technology was required to produce what we recognize as his voice. Now, I had a clip, it's okay, we don't need to play it, which is, it's a CNN report on how Hawking's voice was developed and exponentially developed as a result of improvements in technology in the last number of years. But it proposes at the end of the report to be more or less solving the problem of what we would recognize as the hard problem, the problem of expressing consciousness immediately. And so that was the clip I was going to show. What is very interesting here is that Hawking's tech support is read against its market value, which is the bottom line in the clip. It positions his voice within a multi-billion-dollar financial transaction in a type of news advertisement for the benefits of capital exchange. It also seems to imply that being able to produce Hawking's subjective voice through technology brings us one step closer to solving the hard problem of how consciousness is expressed. In reality, Hawking's vocal synthesizer is a mirror of the hard problem. The hard problem of consciousness is generally recognized as the difficulty of explaining the relationship between physical phenomena such as brain processes and experience, essentially the problem of articulating how human experience becomes understandable to the individual and by extension to others. The difficulty is in explaining how something deeply subjective is translated into something objectively comprehensible. Hawking's speech technology does draw appropriate attention to the central role of language in communication, but it doesn't explain how thought is triggered, simply how it can be expressed in a means other than human voice or in an alternative type of human voice. It had become a way of reading a flicker in his cheek, commensurate to various different letters in an auto cue keyboard. Crucially, it also, the clip, positions the singular voice as that of the individual. There are no ghosts speaking through or in conjunction with the great quantum physicist, just the voice of singular genius. I would like to propose that the nature of the hard problem of consciousness remains a problem for technology, or rather a problem for us in a technological world in which we have yet to find the appropriate measure regarding how technology positions us as both subjects and as objects. How much as subjects who use technology do we have control over our thoughts, actions, and their outcomes, and how much are we positioned by the objective world of technology to experience thoughts, undertake actions, and suffer outcomes over which we have no control? For example, Jeremy Rifkin refers to collaborative commons and/or the Internet of Things as a new mode of production and exchange that leaves behind private property and market relations. Indeed, collaborative commons are to be opposed to the two other forms of social organization, market interactions and centralized planning, such that the Creative Commons can be conceived of, to quote Rifkin, as the domain of radical emancipation. In old-fashioned Marxist theory, the development of new productive forces makes capital relations obsolete, and such a change can potentially transform the means of production. Except, as Slavoj Žižek makes plain, the Internet of Things, the infrastructure of Creative Commons, is the network of physical devices, vehicles, buildings, and other items embedded with electronics, software, sensors, actuators, and network connectivity that enable these objects to collect and exchange data. In this context, human beings are also things whose states and activities are continuously registered and transmitted without their knowledge. In other words, echoing Marx again, the capacity to transform the means of production may be the very thing that accelerates our increasing alienation. One way of explaining the ambivalence that technological development generates is to conceive of our increasing anxiety as a result of the global capital market's influence on the development of new technology. As David Lloyd ably articulates it in The Transformation of Oral Space, given that money represents the moment of identity of all commodities, as exchange values rather than particular use values, so it also takes the place of human social relations. The human individual, abstracted in the form of labor power, becomes, as money also is, one among other commodities, a part of a set of intersecting series of things and objects universally equivalent rather than universally equal. So a key question regarding what McLuhan called the simultaneous extension and amputation of technological breakthrough is how better to distribute the extension of technology rather than its capacity for amputation and alienation. Can this extension extend to reducing or alleviating the growing sense of equivalence and alienation people feel? For example, in an era of precision medicine so tightly prescribed by rising health insurance fees, who will be extended medically and who will be amputated? And in terms of global communication, with the individual as both the subject and object of technology, can technology be used to promote voice in a way that can express the ghost contained within the machine, namely individual and collective objections to its range and influence? And can poiesis, exacted by a writer like Samuel Beckett or a poet like Seamus Heaney, exert the influence necessary to issue a challenging fourth to the increased instrumentalization of technology in late modernity? I would like to propose that a reappraisal of technology might be made possible by an appreciation of Samuel Beckett's aesthetics, which can in turn help us to see how philosophy has dealt with the hard problem. And it has dealt with it in large part not by asking how does consciousness happen, but by asking what does it say? And in so doing, philosophy assumes the presence of a voice. Another way of saying this is that much philosophy implies an inner voice, from Socrates addressing origin by invoking amnesis, or remembering from another time, to Descartes' internalized subjective voice. Inner voice is a philosophical idea that has been absorbed as de facto common sense. The inner voice invariably legitimates human life as it whispers in most moral philosophy, representing the silent, interiorized version of ourselves. Derrida emphasizes the term auto-affection to describe Husserl's phenomenological reduction and his framing of consciousness as a genuine inner experience in which thinking and speaking occur in the same moment. In Speech and Phenomena, Derrida proposes that auto-affection is not an accurate reflection of our inner voice, and that our inner voice is alienated from us because although we think of it as an interiorized experience, it must pass through or mobilize space and time. He notes that for Husserl, a certain outside is suspended by the manner in which subjectivity presents itself to itself and its ideas in the same instant. But for Derrida, taking auto-affection as the exercise of the voice, auto-affection supposed that a pure difference comes to divide self-presence. In this pure difference is rooted the possibility of everything we think we can exclude from auto-affection: space, the outside, the world, the body, etc. I propose that if we were to think of our inner voice as different to us, as all of the dead voices that we inhabit and that inhabit us, then we could begin the process of getting to know ourselves. But because we think of ourselves as unified, and because we are not, technology as the expression of capital reproduction then replicates our self-alienation as part of the problem of modernity, compounding that alienation by rendering us equivalent rather than equal. And as we know, Beckett's work represents the possibility of hearing other voices, as we've heard throughout the conference. For instance, towards the conclusion of his narrative, Malloy is invaded by an uncanny moment of introjection. In reality, I said nothing at all, but I heard a murmur, and then something arose within me, confusedly, a kind of consciousness, which I expressed by saying, I said, etc., or don't do it, Malloy, or is that your mother's name, said the sergeant. And I had no impression of any kind, but simply somewhere something had changed, so that I too had to change in order for nothing to be changed. And Malloy succumbs to the we in the constitution of the I, As Malloy succumbs to the we and the constitution of the I, his personality narrative split at the conclusion, the character ending in a double sense with the line, real spring weather, I long to go back into the forest, or not a real longing, Malloy could stay where he happened to be. Thus, the experience of reading Malloy's narrative is one in which the appearance of the inner voice produces disassociation, which leads to the sense that Malloy is expelled, refugee-like, from his own narrative. This expulsion is coextensive with the end of his narration. Beckett told Deirdre Bair, I wrote Malloy and what followed on the day I became aware of my own stupidity. Then I began to write the things I feel. And the quality of this feeling is one in which anxiety at a loss of self, a loss of a stable refuge for the self-identical subject, can result in that subject's dissolution. For example, Moran in part 2 of Malloy, a character who, in contrast to Malloy, is desperate to keep any sense of dissolution at bay, first notes that although he has never met Malloy, he has knowledge of him, consciousness of him within himself. This causes him to reflect how little one is at one with oneself. Good God. I who prided myself on being a sensible man, cold as crystal, and as free from spurious depth. I knew then about Malloy without, however, knowing much about him. I shall say briefly what little I did know about him. He had very little room. His time, too, was limited. He hastened incessantly on, as if in despair, towards extremely close objectives. Now a prisoner, he hurled himself at I know not what narrow confines, and now hunted, he sought refuge near the centre. Arguably, the centre where Malloy seeks refuge is the centre of Moran himself. Shortly after the mission above, Moran gets the first inkling of the multiplicity within. While he is seeking Malloy, he washes his face in a stream and becomes fascinated by the manner in which the reflection cannot restate his likeness. I dragged myself down to the stream. I lay down and looked at my reflection, then I washed my face and hands. I waited for my image to come back. I watched it as it trembled towards an ever-increasing likeness. Now and then a drop falling from my face shattered it again. His reflection cannot reconverge as a whole image, just as his identity within the novel has begun to fragment. The physical search for Malloy, which has led nowhere, and his appearance in Moran's head ensure that the latter will never again be filled with the simple satisfaction of doing the same routine household duties over and over again. He acknowledges as much when he states, I seem to see myself aging swiftly as a day fly, but the idea of aging was not exactly the one which offered itself to me, and what I saw was more like a crumbling, a frenzied collapsing of all that had protected me from all that I was condemned to be. And again, like the dead voices exchanged from Beckett's Godot, Moran suffers the need to accommodate the multiplicity within Husserl's ostensibly singular inner voice. For both Malloy and Moran, the failure to recognize these voices as their own lead to a type of obliteration. The message is clear. Allied to the necessity of recognizing a delay in time and an exteriority in space, we must also recognize the multiplicity within ourselves, no matter how troubling and fraught the psychological stress it might induce. And arguably stepping outside of ourselves in communion with the other as ourself is a challenging forth in a novel narration in both senses to a new technological relation. I wonder, just to finish, do we have activity? If you could scroll forward. In the other direction. Because you went right to the very, very end. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Okay. So to conclude, a poem like Seamus Heaney's From the Republic of Conscience is an example of technologica in terms of the original meaning, art, craft, oracle, and it remains fertile as a poesis that can articulate profound subjective change. What strikes one immediately is that the Republic of Conscience, there is no single inner voice speaking. In fact, it is profoundly silent to begin with. Instead, running like a silent movie, there is a community of inner people represented by the government of a silent tongue. The symbol of conscience is a boat, one of the first technologies of civilization. The boat is immersed in McLuhan's founding ambivalence. Boats became and remain vessels of human communication and the principal tools of imperial domination. Perhaps for Heaney, the boat evokes all the dead voices of the coffin ships that defined the period of the Irish famine, boats on which millions of people boarded from Ireland in starvation en route to anywhere that the first and last boat might take them. Coffin ships so called because most of the passengers died either through starvation or drowning. In the spring of 2015, with the current refugee crisis unfolding on televisions across the world, and with 1,200 people drowning in April alone, many Irish people contacted their local councillors who began to raise the issue in the Irish government. Weeks later, the L.E. Samuel Beckett, the Irish naval warship, was pulled from duty protecting the privacy of the Star Wars shoot on the Skellig Islands off the coast of Cork and redeployed to the Libyan coast. By New Year's Day 2016, Operation Puntus had rescued 2,310 people from the Mediterranean Sea. When I interviewed the ship's captain, Lieutenant Commander Anthony Geraghty, around 6 months ago, he told me that for him the experience had been like a biblical event. He remembers, "The first rubber boat I saw, the weather was closing in, a bad day. I'm 45 years of age, and every day I've been near the sea or on the sea, so I'm an educated, competent mariner. So I thought, why would anyone get into that boat? The only reason someone would get into a boat like that is as if your life was so bad that you felt the only option, which might include murder, assault, theft, rape, slavery, drowning, is in that boat. You'd get in that boat if you simply had no other choice." When I asked him his thoughts on operating the L.E. Samuel Beckett during the ongoing crisis, he responded with a question of his own. "I know Godot in Waiting for Godot doesn't come. So in this situation in the Mediterranean, could Godot represent the international community which doesn't come when expected? Isn't fulfilling what Godot is supposed to be the manifestation of a better life? And yet at the same time, things don't change. And the sad thing is that nobody is recording this historically, getting this down on film or in a book. There should be a witness. There are 9 Irish ship captains, and all of this is fresh in their minds, and someone needs to capture the Irish Navy's operation in the Mediterranean. People haven't realized yet that it's a really historical time, a shift in understanding of the geography of the world, and it speaks to our Irish history, the famine ships, in a way we should recognize and act upon. It seems to me that the question of voice, not beyond, but including biological, engineering, and technological dimensions, is one that encompasses all of these aspects of human endeavor and asks how can they be put in the service of a subjectivity that first recognizes the refugee within itself. Because the simple truth is that in the increasing alienation of late modernity, as things stand, by imagining our current singularity, we're not really ourselves. Recognizing in the first instance this primary alienation would allow us to either seek reintegration through technology or to recognize its incapacity for such a necessary project. The redeployment of the L.E. Samuel Beckett at the behest of the general public from assigned duty protecting the financial interests of the Walt Disney Corporation to rescuing those in dire straits in the Mediterranean can be considered a microcosm of the process and a measure of the potential results. And poetic voice, as I've attempted to demonstrate, remains a place, despite its marginal and arguably pathological status in late modernity, where these impulses remain strong. In poetry, as in philosophy and technology, we hear human voices calling forth the refuge of a new world, many voices that perhaps we might recognize as our own. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. This is like a little awkward. I have never been at the Beckett Society conference before, so I was kind of not sure what to expect. And in reading and writing about radio, I've kind of assimilated so much of Professor Frost's work that I feel my talk kind of echoes the introductory talk. And now you've just gone and taken the second half of my talk. So we could skip me altogether. But I will read this out, but I do genuinely apologize for a lot of overlap between this and other papers. The question of why Beckett turned to radio. The title of my paper is Beckett's Radio Geographies. The question of why Beckett turned to radio has been a productive question in the field. His turn to radio has afforded scholars the opportunity to theorize a range of issues, not just of concern to Beckett studies, but to cultural theory more generally. His 6 radio texts, along with statements he made about radio in his letters and diaries, have allowed scholars to think about themes such as the history of the BBC and the production of a national acoustic, the distinction between public broadcasting and private listening, the commercialization of the airwaves, the extortion of speech under conditions of torture, under conditions of pressure, even torture, and the history and theory of radio itself, with its uses and abuses. Beckett's radio, in other words, facilitates the theorizing of broader questions of subjectivity, technology, and the acoustic public sphere. Who hears, which voices, when, and where. Radio, too, is the technology that investigates voice. And I'm sorry, I'm going to have to do a little bit of this again. We even quote the same stuff. So, that most uncanny of Beckett objects. Radio separates voice from body, and it can magnify and distill sound. It can loop, edit, and distort voice. The mystery of voice, in many ways, drives the Beckett oeuvre. The origin and source of radio is voice is one of his great themes. From where does voice emanate? Does speech come from the past? Does it point to the future? Does it emerge from deep within his character's memories? Or does it come from without, from ideology and subsequent resistance to cultural demands? Does voice signify presence or absence? Voice in Beckett is a spatial problem. Voices are everywhere, murmuring, half-intelligent things that come out of the dark, as he himself described his desired radio affect. On the one hand, his texts propel wave after wave of restless sound, whose origin points are unknown, distant, and unending. Where now? Who now? When now? On the other hand, voices are deeply intimate and personal in Beckett. In Embers, no sound is spoken or heard by a character. Everything that the radio listener hears is the interior subjective monologue of an old man's memories. Nostalgia percolating upward from within, but never spoken out loud to another. We, the listener, then overhear these personal, interior, and painful thoughts. Voice becomes, therefore, a question of scale in Beckett. The cosmic, the national, the intimate, and the local all reverberate in a disorienting collapse of the far into the near and the personal into the impersonal. Voices that should maintain their silence or be kept apart intrude anxiously into each other. It is this collapse of distance between the impersonally abstract, the train and all that fall, for instance, and the lyrically personal, subjective perception of that same train that creates Beckett's unique tone, a mixture of confusion and belief, doubt and anger. A key question in radio studies, as in theories of the voice, concerns location. Where is radio? Is it in the air? In one's head? In the transmitter? In the receiver? Is radio heard by one or all? Radio appears to be everywhere and nowhere, technological and psychological. The tension in radio waves between their proximity, they always surround us, and their distance, where do they come from, and where in space do they end up, mirrors Beckett's questions about voice. What is it and where is it? Beckett's turn to radio helped him out of a spell of writer's block. It also afforded him the opportunity to reach new audiences via the BBC and later RTF. But much more than such practical concerns, the medium perfectly suited his project of interrogating identity. The voices that emerge out of a distant, mysterious dark and that get broadcast are dislocated and ghostly. They are unsure of themselves. They call to other pasts and they seek out other selves. Radio, caught between the propaganda of the 1930s and 40s and rock music and jingles of the 1960s, could not be left to propaganda, commercialism, and talk radio. Other voices needed to be aired, voices that refuse easy determination and have their own evanescence built into their structure of transmission. My suggestion thus far is that voice and radio share a common concern, that of uncertain location and origin. Voice and radio are simultaneously inside and outside. Our inner voice, that which one is supposed to listen to for authenticity, comes reputedly from deep within. Radio too gets lauded for this inner quality, for provoking what Stephen Connor calls mind space, that imaginative, subjective space of listening. I think podcasts are doing this more and more now. Voice, however, also comes from without, in our culture's use of words, in our region's dialect, and in meanings and inflections inherited from our family. Radio is also exterior in that it emanates from a distant beacon, which throws off electromagnetic energy in every direction, not caring about who in particular receives it. Radio is impersonal in this way, but we receive it in our private rooms and spaces. Radio and voice, therefore, trouble theory. Both objects are difficult to pin down, to locate. They are both here and there, present and immediately past. They are resistant, therefore, to disciplinary logic. The concept of voice has always been central to critical theory, as it confronts the problem of truth, its location and mediation. In A Voice and Nothing More, Madeleine Dallaire gives the reader a psychoanalytic history of the voice as the unattainable other. He reminds us that the origin of the word acoustics, the science of hearing, comes from the name of Pythagoras' disciples, the acousmati, who learned by listening to their masters from behind a curtain, never being able to see him. The idea being that good students would be tied to their master's voice, not distracted by the mentor's looks, clothing, or body language. The pupil had only to concentrate on voice. The body disappeared, leaving, supposedly, only unmediated pure speech. Millennia later, we find philosophy still confronting the ambiguity at the heart of voice. Derrida launches his career with his book Voice and Phenomena, in which he deconstructs the claim that there's any synthesis between a voice and more authentic meaning. Neither the voice inside nor that outside is original and pure. What's relevant in the modern history of critical theory is that in theorizing voice, cultural criticism also tunes into the radio. John Moa contends in Radio, Essays in Bad Reception, that radio as it got picked up and received by critical theory, from Brecht to Adorno to British cultural studies and to post-colonial theory, poses questions about spatiality, the tension between intimacy and propaganda, between the national and the local, and between official radio and pirate radio. It's in his famous essay, The Radio's Communication Apparatus, for example, that Brecht takes up the possibilities of eclectic populist material in the early days of radio. Quote, "In this Tower of Babel, cacophony and dissonance come forth that could not be ignored. In this acoustic department store, it was possible to learn to breed chickens in English, accompanied to the strains of the Pilgrim's Chorus." End quote. English-trained chickens, American pilgrims, German department stores, radio for Brecht brings the far near, as in Orson Welles' The War of the Worlds, and it projects the local to infinity. For Adorno, in his essay, The Radio Voice, one ascribes personality to a distant radio voice in order to compensate for the invisibility of the source. Physiognomy enters the radio. "This woman has a nice voice," he writes, or "this man has an arrogant voice." Radio comes, as Beckett says, out of the dark, from a mysterious and distant point, yet it enters our most personal space, our kitchens, our cars, our bedrooms. For Adorno, one compensates for the remote, distant subject with familial closeness, a comforting, avuncular voice. These questions of spatiality, clashing scales, the tension between abstract and subjective space, the blurring of boundaries and multiplicity of locations, have increasingly led me toward the discipline of geography in order to make sense of Beckett's radio. Radio makes an intervention in critical theory, inasmuch as radio airs the philosophical tension between presence and absence. Think, for example, of all the ways that the here and the there, the then and the now, merge and separate in Beckett's radio broadcast, The Capital of Ruins. Behind critical theory's attention to the uncanny objects of radio and voice lie changes in the material and physical environment. A dialectical process, no doubt. Concepts of space are inseparable from changes to place. Contemporary with Beckett's radio productions, which began in 1957, the production of space was increasingly being theorized by from a number of directions. Phenomenology, led by Gaston Bachelard, promoted the lived experience of space over that of the designs of architects and planners. Marxist geography, led by Henri Lefebvre, highlighted the class contradictions being solidified in concrete. The Situationist International, also formed in 1957 by Guy Debord, showed the ways in which the mass media developed images of urban spectacle in order to distract from more spontaneous human interaction. I argue that Beckett's radio plays join this constellation of events that is thinking about space in France and in post-World War II Europe more generally. Two events in particular are important when thinking about the production of space in the 1950s and 60s, and both are connected to voice and radio. The first is decolonization, such as in Algeria, and the rethinking it required of the space of the nation and its collective voice, along with the problem of what the emerging voice of the decolonized would sound like. Who would speak for the new emerging nation? We can think of the geography of Beckett's radio in terms of the struggle between the broadcasting of an official voice, a nationalist voice, for example, Radio France or the BBC Home Service, and voices that are more fragmented, dislocated, even post-colonial. The second spatial shift occurring with Beckett's turn to radio is the rapid urbanization and modernization of cities. Post-war urban planning turned its attention to facilitating speed, the use of the car, and the car radio was invented in France at this time, suburbanization and sprawl, as well as the consolidation of class and racially separated neighborhoods. Paris is at the heart of such moves. The building of Le Périphérique, Europe's first ring road and busiest stretch of highway, also began in 1957, the year of Beckett's first radio broadcast. In fact, it was largely to escape the Parisian cacophony and to find silence that he purchased his cottage in Uzi. The first phase of Le Périph' was built from Porte de la Plaine to Porte de l'Italie, and it was the section that was most adjacent to where Beckett lived. Along the exterior route, Le Périphérique, French planners built the now infamous banlieue, designed to house the working class and fast-arriving immigrant workers. Migrant workers and their voices were pushed to the urban periphery, out of view from official France, the museum-centered core. Both decolonization and the construction of Le Périph' are relevant for radio studies and for thinking about voice. Famously and intriguingly, it's to the revolutionary radio, what he calls rebel radio, that Frantz Fanon turns when he writes about subaltern identity. Published in 1959, but about events in 1956, when, quote, tracts were first distributed, end quote, announcing the existence of the voice of free Algeria, Fanon's essay theorizes voices that work against easy ideology and agency. The voice of Algeria radio, Fanon writes, speaks from the mountains and is often absent, physically inaudible, but it became materialized in an irrefutable way. The nature of this voice recalled in more than one way that of the revolution, present, in the air, in isolated pieces, but not objectively. Due to French jamming of wavelengths, hours of broadcasting were erratic, but behind the chaos, writes Fanon, the listener would compensate for the fragmentary nature by an autonomous creation of information. The voice of Algeria led the life of a fugitive. So when the voice of free Algeria is heard to say, here is the voice of Algeria, where is that voice? In the mountains? In the town? It is like the where-when voice of Beckett. When does the voice speak? It is the voice of revolution of the past calling from history, but it also announces itself from the future. This is Algeria, a country that is coming into being, but does not yet exist. There is no cognitive mapping of the revolutionary voice. In the same way, Beckett's radio voices, broadcast contemporaneously with the Algerian War, are also ethereal and discontinuous. They escape easy identity and resist sovereignty. The voice must be filled in by the collective for Fanon and by the listener for Beckett. The request is for the listener to help in the struggle of articulation. The construction of Le Périphérique, beginning in 1956, is not unconnected to the space of decolonization. The new expressway cuts the classical city off from its high-rise immigrant other. In the 1600s, Les Zones, the periphery of Paris, on which Le Périphérique was overlain, attracted migrant laborers, rural workers, a transient population of peasants and bandits. A zonier, or a zonard in French, still refers to a loiterer. Paris has leaped over 6 walls. Le Périph' was built on the open area outside the Thiers Wall, named after the President Adolphe Thiers, who insisted on new fortifications around the city in 1841. It was forbidden to build on land for 150 yards outside the wall. In subsequent decades, however, the zone, as it came to be known, acted as what Foucault might call heterotopia. Circus acts came to reside in it. The Parisian bourgeoisie would picnic on it in famous Impressionist paintings. Immigrants from the countryside arrived, then migrants from Eastern Europe, then those from North Africa, then those from Indochina would flock to it, live there. Many became stuck there, caught like a Beckett anti-hero. Indeed, a definitive translation of the 1912 poem, Zone, by the surrealist Apollinaire, was completed by Beckett in 1950. So that the outcasts of famine Ireland or the refugees of World War II, who are projected onto the spaces of Beckett's plays and fiction, we can now add the gypsies, the unemployed, the war deserters, and the refugees who populated the Parisian outskirts. As France modernized and set up yet another ringed fortress of constantly moving traffic, Beckett's radio, I suggest, reflects an attempt, via the physics of the airwave, to blur boundaries, not intensify them, to democratize and soften voice, rather than calcify it and steer it into preordained channels. Les Périphériques epitomized modernizing, increasingly confident, post-war de Gaullist France. The road illuminated the bureaucratic and integrated elements of urban planning, urbanisme, which became an official French discipline in that country at the School of Fine Arts, also in the mid-1950s. Urbanism sought to administer in rational fashion all integrated elements of modern life, from economics and housing to health and leisure, via spatial rationalization and centralization. To counter this empirical planning state, the geographer and philosopher Gaston Bachelard published in 1956 The Poetics of Space. In that text, he stressed, much like Beckett, the dialectical relationship between imagination and realism. Bachelard asked the post-war French public to reject the science of modern urban planning and its accompanying sociology of everyday life and governmental voice. Bachelard too wrote for radio. In his essay, Radio and Reverie, Bachelard argues that the medium could bridge alienation while opening up an axis of intimacy. Copies of Beckett's text still exist in Beckett's library. Beckett may have seen in him an ally in critiquing positivism and emphasizing the role of perception and imagination within the world of engineering and technology. Beckett, always interested in experimenting with different media, switched to radio and the medium of the airwaves in the mid and late 1950s. With sound engineers and editors, he liked distorting the familiar while bringing the intimate into production via technical mediation. Radio allowed for interiority, collapsing the world into the inside of a head. At the same time, intimate emotions could be broadcast, thrown out expansively to the world. Unlike the streamlining of traffic that forced commuters along preordained routes, radio waves had the ability to reach, theoretically, an infinite distance in all directions. Radio waves resist national borders. All that fall is attuned to Irish dialect and provincialism. Yet radio is also cosmopolitan in its ability to spread across a landscape and to be received by anyone with a transistor. Once a wave is let loose, it exists independent of the original output. For Beckett, I think there was something democratic about radio, or rather he wished to test radio, to see its potential to create free, if difficult, listening. The medium of the air couldn't be handed over to commercialism and the top 40. I've tried to suggest three things in this paper. First, his interest in the medium of radio and radio waves was an experiment with the concept of voice, and that voice from its location to how it's received is a spatial problem. The location of voice is in our heads and in the ether, and in some distant origin, an aerial or a satellite hundreds of thousands of miles away. All of this appealed to a sense of mystery and ideological uncertainty. Second, I wish to raise the idea that voice is a problem that gets theorized in radio, and that the space of radio resided in theory as much as on the airwaves. Philosophy must always contend with voice, for voice is what is consistently immediate and immediately gone. Voice suggests truth and presence, but also suggests slippery tone and absence. How we theorize the history of radio shapes how we read Beckett. Third, I'm drawn to the idea that theory never exists in a vacuum. Understanding objects called voice and radio require geography. There can be neither voice nor radio outside of space. Beckett famously made Paris his home, and Paris was changing with speed. Voice, radio, theory, none can be abstracted from waves of urban and spatial change. Thank you.
So first, a few words to introduce this paper and put it in the context of a larger argument. I've been working on a project that uses French phenomenology to tease out a particular understanding of agency in Beckett's work. This version of agency posits a more integrated relationship between the human and our material environment than does the notion of agency as will that we inherit from the Enlightenment. It also avoids post-structuralism's way of jeopardizing agency by positing the subject as an effect of structures such as language. For phenomenology, subjectivity arises from the position of the body in relation to its environment. What I'll do in this paper is look at Beckett's engagement with aspects of the surrealist movement to think through how his interest in agency and lack of agency plays out, especially through his use of different artistic media, each of which explores the human's relation to its physical environment in a different way. Before beginning, I'll underscore the fact that I share Rosi Braidotti's description of post-humanism not as a rejection of humanism, but as an attempt to arrive at a more capacious and nuanced understanding of the human in relation to the non-human. In The Post-Human, 2013, Braidotti writes, "We need to devise new social, ethical, and discursive schemes of subject formation to match the profound transformations we are undergoing. The post-human condition urges us to think critically and creatively about who and what we are actually in the process of becoming." I'll begin by talking about two different strands of surrealism. The first and most familiar extols the relaxation of volition and the logic and rationalism that volition entails, while the other celebrates a plurality of artistic media. André Breton's 1924 Surrealist Manifesto gives the definition of surrealism with which we are most familiar. Psychic automatism in its pure state, by which one proposes to express verbally, by means of the written word, or in any other manner, the actual functioning of thought, dictated by the thought in the absence of any control exercised by reason. This early coinage of surrealism, Breton's more formal baptism of surrealism buries an earlier coinage of the term by Guillaume Apollinaire. In a program note to accompany the ballet Parade, which premiered in May 1917 at the Théâtre du Châtelet in Paris, Apollinaire used the word surrealism to refer to the work's way of integrating different artistic media. The ballet comprised writing by Jean Cocteau, music by Erik Satie, choreography by Léonide Massine, and costume and set design, including a famous painted curtain by Picasso. Apollinaire praised the early 20th century Gesamtkunstwerk, writing that it consummated for the first time the alliance of painting and dance, of plastic and mime, which is the sign of a more complete art. From this new alliance, there has come about, in Parade, a kind of super-realism, surrealisme. Surrealism's celebration of hybridity, a collaboration of different artistic media to multiply perspectives on what is unrepresentable, proves useful for thinking about Beckett's relationship to surrealism, as well as his way of experimenting with different media. Beckett's formal innovation is achieved in part through this experimentation with different media, though his tendency is to move between different artistic media rather than integrating them in one production. In an oft-quoted interview from 1961, Beckett expresses the importance he attaches to form and to the reinvention of form. To find a form that accommodates the mess, that is the task of the artist now. My aim is to consider Beckett's relation to surrealism through his ideas about form, which I use here to refer to the structure and style of a work. Beckett's engagement with form, I argue, moves him to embrace a more capacious version of humanism, one that is open to chance and hospitable to what is automatic and irrational within the human. This is part of the definition of post-humanism that I'm adapting from Braidotti. I argue that Beckett does this by exaggerating a trope already present in surrealist art, integration of the human subject within its physical environment. I put myself in the camp of those who find Beckett's debt to surrealism necessary to a nuanced understanding of his work. Beckett's way of navigating surrealism, borrowing from it, mocking it, deviating from it, allows him to sustain an energetic ambivalence between humanistic concerns, character, individual pathos, the mind's ability or inability to reason, and formalist ones, style, permutations, geometric patterns. The dialectic of what I'm calling the human and the formal, which could also be called the personal and the structural, creates one of the most compelling tensions in Beckett's work. Ackerley and Guntarsky write that Beckett is acknowledged as a forerunner of theoretical post-humanism, acutely recognizing the forces of human heteronomy, putatively determining who and what we are: language, discourse, technology, desire, ideology, the unconscious, and social formation. The pitiless permutations of what, the relentless self-undercutting of the unnameable, and the compulsive incantations of how it is and not I offer evidence of language as an inhuman archive of alterity with its own impersonal agency. They go on to attribute the indeterminacy of the humanist, post-humanist question in Beckett to his unresolved treatment of Cartesian dualism, linking humanism to the transcendental power of the cogito to think through a logicality and ground itself. But if I'm going to argue that it is Beckett's engagement with surrealism that anticipates post-humanism, then it is necessary to reckon with Beckett's denial of surrealist formlessness, which he talks about in an interview with Lawrence Harvey, his loyalty to Joyce, which Knowlson claims distanced him from surrealism, and his parodies of the movement. Knowlson writes that Beckett could not feel close to the surrealists, largely because they were distinctly cool, if not actively hostile to Joyce. But Beckett shared in the thrilling atmosphere of experiment and innovation that surrounded surrealism. More recently, Alan Warren Friedman has shown the extent to which both Joyce and surrealism were formative for Beckett. The title of Beckett's early novel, Dream of Fair to Middling Women, has been thought to mock the omnipotence Breton attaches to the dreaming state. In Eleutheria, Violetta Krapp, having covered her absent son's chair in barbed wire, is said to have done so under the spell of the surrealist exhibition. But parody, especially in Beckett, more often evidences intense engagement than it signals dismissal, and it is certain that Beckett spent his formative years immersed in surrealist literature. Marianne Cause and Pascal Sardin, among others, have called attention to the large number of surrealist texts that Beckett translated, both for the journal Transition and for a special edition of this quarter, the Surrealist Number, co-edited by André Breton and Edward Titus in 1932. Knowlson draws on the letters to show that Beckett actually did far more translations than previously thought, since many of his translations appeared at Beckett's request unsigned. Calling Beckett a passeur of surrealism into English, Sardin traces the influence of the texts he translated on his work. So vaduity, a favorite word of Krapp in Krapp's last tape, comes from the poem La Vue by Paul Éluard, while Breton's description of surrealist practice as a monologue poured out as rapidly as possible, over which the subject's critical sense claims no share, anticipates the unnameable, and especially not I. In addition to Alan Warren Friedman, whose recent book is a full-length study of surreal Beckett, the most ardent supporter of surrealism's centrality to Beckett's aesthetic is Daniel Albright, who claims Beckett spent his whole life under the spell of the surrealist exhibition. His instincts were surrealist. Albright gives a striking example of surrealist imagery in his discussion of Happy Days. Alluding to Courbet's painting The Origin of the World, Albright suggests that Winnie's sex organs have dilated, engorged into a whole hot universe. The human and the landscape have been grotesquely intermingled, as in certain surrealist paintings. Winnie is not so much buried in the world as giving birth to it. She is, quote, a hideous jumble of stage set and lead character, such that to play the role of Winnie is to become an environment as well as a person. For Albright, though, it is Beckett's treatment of artistic media that brings him closest to surrealism, a movement born out of the very discords among artistic media that were to excite Beckett's imagination. Albright then claims that a surrealist aesthetic leads Beckett irresistibly towards mathematics and to an interest in form. Other critics caution that viewing Beckett as an empty formalist fails to account for the humanity of his characters and their bodily presence on stage. In her review of Albright's book, Linda Ben-Zvi suggests that the human in Beckett is overshadowed or eclipsed by a surrealist reading. She takes issue with Albright's claim that Ghost Trio is, quote, a game with superimposed rectangles, the visual system detaching itself from every human meaning. This description is better applied, perhaps, to the television play Quad. Ben-Zvi faults Albright for seeing structures, not people, and for claiming that human beings are only flimsy, jury-rigged theatrical contrivances. Jury-rigged theatrical conveniences. This debate between humanism and formalism goes to the heart of what Beckett is doing. For his work is at once all too human and fascinated by form, its ability and inability to map the chaos, what Beckett calls the mess of the human condition. Albright relates Beckett's exploration of diverse artistic media to a break with representational art. Beckett's desire for non-figurative painting that could cut itself free from all allusion to the external world also manifests itself in his praise of the Dutch abstract painter Bram van Velde. Albright argues that Beckett foregrounds any medium he uses, making it speak by emphasizing its inadequacies and using it in awkward ways. This thickening of the artistic lens, this calling attention to itself of an artistic medium, takes the place of representing an external object. Albright points out that this version of realism, attained through calculated disharmony of means, recalls Apollinaire's original idea of the surreal. Albright writes, Beckett's work took shape both according to the psychic automatic surrealism of Breton and his followers, and according to the original surrealism of Apollinaire, in which reality was violently seized in the contrapuntal friction among competing media of music, painting, and discourse. Beckett's experiments with artistic media, particularly his way of purposefully mishandling them so as to stretch their bounds, contribute to a broader interest in formal innovation. Transitions between media, like translations of languages, may invigorate the host medium, such that prose, for example, receives inspiration from the pictorial plane. Albright said of Beckett's late prose, quote, "Fictions develop the dead immobility of pictures." For Breton, formal play emerges as a way of startling perception, rerouting the ruts of habit so as to free the imagination. He encourages the subconscious to emerge through practices such as automatic writing, designed to break through cultural, social, and artistic convention. Breton devotes a section of his 1924 manifesto to arguing that the novel is a degraded form so wedded to realism that it stifles the imagination. Beckett also works to divest the novel of its orderliness, first by parodying, then departing from the narrative trope of the quest in the trilogy. He also juxtaposes disjunctive sentences, as at the end of Malloy. Then I went back into the house and wrote, "It is midnight, the rain is beating on the windows, it was not midnight, it was not raining." Breton contends that the fortuitous juxtaposition of two terms gives birth to what he calls the image. And the more disparate the terms, the more vigorous the image. This colliding of contraries, inherited perhaps from Tristan Tzara's idea that the yes and the no meet on the street corners like grasshoppers, stimulates and invigorates the imagination. I'll take two examples of surrealist works that play at joining contraries. Merit Oppenheim's well-known sculpture from 1936 and a photograph from Man Ray's 1933 series Érotique Voilée. In Oppenheim's piece, the pairing of the furry with the smooth, the luxurious sensuous with the quotidian, creates surprise that may elicit an inner smile. In Man Ray's photograph of Oppenheim interacting with a printing press, not only is the softness of the female body juxtaposed against the mechanical, but literary art is presented as part of the visual, tangible world. Both pieces mix disparate elements and subvert convention, delivering vital shocks to the expectations. In Beckett, too, tension between form and the human plays out in juxtaposed contraries. Imagine, Dead Imagine, from 1965, brings the formal and the human together in a particularly striking way. The prose, coldly exact in style, describes a rotunda in which two bodies are arranged in the fetal position. Fluctuations of light and heat make us keenly aware, as in a related work, The Lost Ones, of bodily discomfort. Clinical descriptions are given of limbs positioned relative to letters. Still on the ground, bent in three, the head against the wall at B, the arse against the wall at A, the knees against the wall at B and C, the feet against the wall at C and A, and so forth. After this fastidious account of the position of the man and the woman, and of the man and the woman's bodies, we learn, hold a mirror to their lips, it mists. The bodies, whole and in fairly good condition to judge by the surfaces exposed to view, are part of a spatial and verbal configuration, a form, yet endowed with sensation and history. The narrator wonders if they still lie still in the stress of that storm, or of a worse storm, or in the black dark for good, or in the whiteness unchanging, and if not, what they are doing. The pathos of bodies enduring, facing away from one another, emerges from their position and shape within the rotunda. Here, Beckett's preoccupation with form adapts a strategy characteristic of surrealism. Subject and object positions are intermingled. Breton insists on not separating the looker from the looked at, which are linked by a magic thread or communicating wire. Accordingly, the bodies in Imagine Dead Imagine blend almost imperceptibly into their surroundings, merging in the white ground were it not for the long hair. Sweat and mirror notwithstanding, they might as well pass for inanimate. With the most human parts of their subjectivity evacuated, volition, intention, as, quote, the faces seem to want nothing essential, end quote, they become landscape-like. In What is Literature, Sartre, commenting on surrealism, wrote that automatic writing was, above all, a destruction of subjectivity. He added that the surrealist's second step was to destroy objectivity in turn. By valorizing dreams and parts of the human that are beyond conscious control, surrealism rejected Enlightenment versions of humanism, destroying, as Sartre would have it, subjectivity. But in the same gesture, objects became less object-like, as inanimate things and landscapes became charged with dynamism and vitality. In both Breton and Beckett's fiction, the sky becomes solid enough. This is an example of objects becoming animate. The sky becomes solid enough to interact with the human body. Usually pictured as ubiquitous and unreachable, the sky becomes physically accessible in the magnetic fields, 1920. Breton and Soupeau write, another man standing in front of a perfume shop was listening to the rolling of a distant drum. The night that was gliding over his head came to rest on his shoulders. A similar description of the sky is found in The End, 1946, when the narrator remarks, I looked up at the sky. I felt it weighing softly on my face. I rubbed my face against it, one cheek after the other, turning my head from side to side. In both Breton and Beckett, the sky becomes an intimate, resting on the shoulders or nuzzling the cheek. This coming together of subject and subject and landscape is typical of Beckett's fiction from this post-war period. Narrators are deprived of conscious intention, and bodies mingle disturbingly with environments. Observing a town's deserted air, the narrator of the calmative exclaims, we are, needless to say, in a skull. The idea of a skullscape finds its way into many interpretations of Beckett. It has also been said that the set of Endgame resembles a skull, its high windows serving as eye sockets. The plain rotunda of Imagine Dead Imagine, too, is solid throughout, a ring, as in the imagination, the ring of bone. The skullscape is worth attention here because it illustrates so neatly the way in which place can invade the body. The environment of the calmative is a good example. Ruins move, its ports, dens, and ruins move within the narrator. Also in the story The End, the border between the human environment collapses more catastrophically. The sea, the sky, the mountains, and the islands closed in and crushed me in a mighty systole. The narrator also describes being pumped through the body of the landscape, which he personifies by attributing to it a heartbeat, systole, diastole. For the surrealists, a human subject's lack of conscious control can open her to chance, to the bounties of the unconscious, to the joy of an encounter. Marianne Cause describes the surrealist ambition towards a continuous state of expectancy, an openness to chance. Chance had its perfect emplacement on the sidewalk, the frequent site of the magical encounter. This very openness, post-logical, characterizes surrealism's optimistic outlook. But even as subject and object roles are reversed and sometimes intermingled in Beckett, his series, repetitions, and permutations don't seem to share surrealism's ebullience or optimism. Even the colors of quad, energetic at first, turn sinister, and the inability of Beckett's narrators to trace the provenance of voices is far from exhilarating. We might think of the sourceless voice of company, which comes to one in the dark, Imagine. In Beckett, as in de Chirico's paintings, objects and landscapes, material worlds, are embedded in the human. De Chirico's The Archaeologists from 1927 renders the internal organs of two faceless mannequins as architectural debris from an ancient city. Autonomic processes, digestion, breathing, circulation, are replaced by Doric columns and aqueducts, symbols of human industry and volition. If the human and the environment are imbricated somehow within one another, humans must contend with the unfreedom of belonging in a very physical way to the world. In Beckett, imagination is not free of the body and not free of mortality. This comes across with particular force in the last two works of Beckett's late trilogy, Ill Seen, Ill Said. In Ill Seen, Ill Said, a woman grows stone-like, forestalling death as she begins to blend into her material surroundings. Everywhere whiteness is gaining. Worstward Ho blends the human, rendered as three shades, into the world through the progressive worsening of their bodies. This reminds us of mortality not in a morbid way, but in a manner that suggests that a rational humanist subject is a bulwark not only against flights of the imagination, for which Breton faults it, but also against death. Surrealism's optimism is tempered in Beckett by a more balanced view of the human condition, an unflinching exploration of what it means to be caught up physically in the world. In an article for the New York Review of Books, Koim Tobin pairs Beckett's late prose with the work of Francis Bacon, describing how both writer and painter turned to disfiguring and reforming the human body in their late work. This fraught condition is rendered marvelously by a writer who, like Beckett, composed on the fringes of surrealism, aware of the movement's credo but resisting membership. In his story, Le Passe-Muraille, the man who could walk through walls, Marcel Aimé writes of a man nicknamed the Lone Wolf, Garou Garou. After many exploits, thanks to his magic ability to walk through walls, his bodily vulnerability, a headache after an amorous tryst, leads to the loss of his powers at an inopportune moment. He gets stuck in mid-wall and remains immured, a case of one unhappily imbricated in his environment. I have suggested that Beckett is most productively aligned with surrealism through his interest in formal innovation, which involves migration between different artistic media and a rapprochement between the human and its physical environment, a variation on the surrealist trope of animating objects and silencing subjects. This culminates, perhaps, in a revised view of the human, one more accepting of chance and automatism in uneasy partnership with volition. That's objects talking at the end. Thank you.